Welcome to the Waddell-Sea Expedition video conference for today called Staying Safe in Antarctica. My name is Lizzie Rosenberger and I am the program manager for the Waddell-Sea Expedition Education and Outreach with Reach the World in partnership with the Explorers Club and fully supported by the Flotilla Foundation. So today we have a very special guest who is a member of the Explorers Club, and he is here to talk with us about how you stay safe while in Antarctica. As we know from Holly and her crew, it's one of the harshest environments on Earth. So we are going to hear from Jeremy Hirschhorn today. He is an expedition risk manager. He is a team builder. He is an explorer. And he is going to share with us everything that he knows about how to stay safe in Antarctica from the time that he spent down in Antarctica. He was a member of the United States Antarctic Program, which is very exciting, and he's going to talk to us about that. He's also been all over the world. He's been climbing and trekking and diving all across the world, both in some really cold places and some places that are a little bit warmer. So we are very lucky to have him here. Some more about his background. He also is, for the past 12 years, has been a firefighter, an EMT, a technical rescue specialist. We'll have to find out what that is. And he also is a rescue diver. So for scuba diving, he can go down and rescue people. And he is also a pilot. So he knows how to fly airplanes. So what we're going to do is we are all going to say hello to Jeremy. And then today we're going to have a little bit of a different type of conversation. I'm going to ask Jeremy a question, and then Jeremy is going to share with us his response to that question. So I like to call it a fireside chat. So you can imagine yourself sitting next to the fireplace. Jeremy and I will be next to an imaginary fireplace, and we'll have a nice chat together. And then, as always, you all will have the opportunity to ask questions. So we also have Tim Jacob here, who is my Reach the World coworker, who we have seen before on our video conferences, and he will be hosting the chat. So if you have a question that comes up while Jeremy is talking about something, feel free to put it into the chat, and we will get to all of those questions as well. So now let's go ahead, and I'm gonna unmute Jeremy so that he can say hello to you all, and then we're going to go class by class so you can say hello to Jeremy as well. So here's Jeremy unmuted, and we are going to start today with Mr. Lee's class, who is in California. You can go ahead and say hello.
Hi! What's up?
Excellent. Next we have from Reading, Massachusetts, Mr. McLaughlin's class.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Excellent. Next we have from Miss Stevens' class from Kentucky. Are you all there? Hello. And next we have Miss Long's class from Colorado. Wonderful. And we have Miss Hogertrip's class from British Columbia. And we have Miss Patterson's class, also from British Columbia.
Hello.
Hello.
And we have Lucy, who is from Vancouver. We can't see you, but can we hear you, Lucy?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Lucy.
And it looks like Miss Chapman's class is coming in right now from Oklahoma. Wonderful. So I think that is all of our classes who are here. So I am going to keep you all muted so that we can hear nice and clearly the questions for Jeremy. So we are going to start with our very first question. And the first question is, what inspired you to go to Antarctica, and how old were you when you first went?
Yeah, it's a great, really interesting question. So when I graduated college, I worked for a science education nonprofit. So I've always really been curious about all the different sciences. And shortly after I graduated college, I was really itching to go on a wild adventure. And I had a couple of different interests, but believe it or not, I was watching the Weather Channel of all things. And they do have more than just the weather forecast on the Weather Channel. And there was a documentary about people who live and work in Antarctica. And obviously there was a lot of focus on all the different science projects going on there. But they also mentioned that there are EMTs in Antarctica. And at the time I was an EMT, so that really sparked my interest. And I started doing all of the research that I possibly could. And I went online and I tried to find as many people who had been down there or were down there at the time and talk to them. And this opportunity came up with the United States Antarctic Program and the National Science Foundation. So I went through a really long application process, talked to a lot of different people, had to get a lot of different doctor's checkups and waivers and signatures, but ultimately I got down there and I was 22 years old when I went down. So a little bit older now, but it was a pretty exciting adventure for being there.
Excellent. So our next question for you is, you mentioned that how you got there was with the National Science Foundation. So what is the National Science Foundation, and how, besides watching the Weather Channel, did you find out about the United States the United States Antarctic Program that's down with the National Science Foundation?
Sure. So the National Science Foundation is a U.S. government agency that funds research, science projects, and education. So when a group of scientists or researchers needs to get money or logistical help or some type of support, they will look to the National Science Foundation to help provide that. So that's something that the U.S. government does. And they have lots of different programs underneath them. And one of those, under the Office of Polar Programs, is the U.S. Antarctic Program. So that's one big program, and underneath that is all the U.S. science that happens in Antarctica. And they run primarily 3 research bases. McMurdo Station, which is on the coast in the Ross Sea. They run the Edmonton Scott South Pole Station, which is right at the South Pole. And Palmer Station, which is on the Antarctic Peninsula, right next to the Weddell Sea, which I think you all are pretty familiar with. And it was through the Antarctic program that I was able to go down to both McMurdo Station and the South Pole Station. My background to get down there was kind of unique. So I was a volunteer firefighter. It wasn't even my full-time job for a number of years before I decided to go down. And I had also become an EMT in college. So I had that type of experience. I really enjoyed doing that. But I was also really interested in the outdoors and doing things outside of the city. So when I saw an opportunity to bring my emergency services background and my love of adventure and the outdoors together into something I could actually get paid for, it seemed pretty exciting. Before this, I really didn't know that there were people who weren't scientists that got to go to Antarctica. And this was a really exciting thing to find out. And once I got down there, I actually realized that it takes quite a bit to support all the different science projects that are going on down there. In fact, I think it takes 9 people to every 1 science researcher just to support what's going on down there. So there's a whole lot of science support staff, which is what I would be classified as, to all the science. So everyone's working really as a team down there to keep everyone safe, to make sure that all the science and research projects go off without a hitch, and they can come home safely.
Wow, 9 different people for one scientist. That is a lot. So,
Yeah.
Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about what your roles and your responsibilities were while you were down there? Kind of what the day-to-day life was like?
Sure. So my job while I was down there was to be a firefighter and EMT. And believe it or not, there are firefighters down there. It's a full-time fire department, but it's a little bit different than what you might see here in North America. We had lots of different responsibilities, but primarily it was, like I said, keeping people safe. And we did that in a few different ways. So we would respond to any type of emergency call. So just like you'd call 911 here, you can do that at the stations as well. So we had all types of different equipment that we could go and respond to emergencies with. And we'd also do that for medical calls. Sometimes people would get hurt or wouldn't feel well, and we would go and help take care of them and bring them over to the doctor. There's actually a clinic at all of the US stations. So we would be able to go out with an ambulance. So very similar to the type of ambulance you'd see here, go out with an ambulance, help treat someone and bring them back to the clinic. Another really interesting thing that we got to do was work with the US Air Force. So the US Air Force operates quite a bit down in Antarctica, and they help to support the US Antarctic Program and all the different science projects going down there. So I and all of the people that I worked with are specially trained to be what are called ARF, or Airport Rescue Firefighting qualified as well. So we get to go down to the different airfields that are scattered around the research bases and make sure that all the planes land safely. So we had a lot of different responsibilities, but it was quite interesting. And I can actually bring up a few pictures of what life was like while I was working down there, if you guys want to see some pictures. So just bear with me as I share my screen. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet. Oh, yes, we can now.
Excellent. All right. So, like I said, we worked a little bit with the Air Force down on the airfields, and we had lots of different types of planes that would come in. And this big one here is what would bring most of the people and equipment and supplies down to Antarctica. We have a little bit of smaller planes here. These are called Hercules airplanes, LC-130s. And if you look on the very bottom, one of the unique things here is that they actually have skis on them. So unlike regular planes that land at airports near you, these actually have skis on their wheels. So instead of landing on hard pavement, they can land on ice and snow. And that was pretty cool. So these pictures were taken right where we sit. The firefighters sit at the edge of the runway, making sure that the planes land safely, because it's very cold, and unfortunately, planes don't do well when it's very, very, very cold. They sometimes could break down or have a problem, so we're there to help them out. But what's really neat is that to get down to Antarctica, we actually have to fly in these planes just alongside the cargo. So if you think about taking a flight anywhere near home or going on vacation, you have a nice comfortable seat. That's not really how you get down to Antarctica. You are basically just additional cargo. So this is a picture inside one of those planes. You'll see all the cargo under the nets in the middle, and there's people sitting alongside. Here's another picture. Everyone getting up, putting on their really big warm coats, getting ready to go out. But it's not very comfortable, but it's pretty exciting to get to fly in one of these giant military transport planes and get down to Antarctica.
Wonderful. Wow. I don't think I've really ever seen a plane with skis like that. That is pretty cool. So being a firefighter in Antarctica, it seems like Antarctica is pretty cold. So why are there fires that happen in Antarctica, and how does that kind of work?
Yes. So I'm pretty sure you've talked about it in some of your past chats, but Antarctica is not just the coldest and the windiest continent on the planet, but it's also the driest. It's actually a desert. They really don't get much more than about 8 to 10 inches of precipitation a year, and that usually happens just in limited places on the coast. So because it's so dry, fire is actually one of the biggest risks to the scientists, the support staff, and the bases themselves. Because it's so dry, a small spark or a small fire can turn into a really big problem very, very quickly. So it's important that there are people who are down there to be able to put those fires out or to stop anything from happening even before it starts. So we have these really specialized fire hydrants. They're not like the red and yellow ones that you see at home. They're giant insulated tubes that have the ability to have water put through them only when you need to, because if they had water in them all the time, like your hydrants at home do, they would freeze very, very quickly. So we were there and we did not just responding to emergencies when they happen, but we'd also work with a lot of the different science projects and support people and go around the stations and try to pick out the things that we thought could potentially be a problem or cause an emergency later on and fix them before anything happens. So we were there to prevent things going badly, but also to help out when things actually did go wrong.
Wonderful. That kind of, for me, that just inspired a potential science experiment, students. Maybe you could try and get a cup with a straw going out of it and see if it's really cold, maybe put it in your freezer if you live somewhere warmer, but if it's cold outside, you can put it outside and see if there's a difference in how water goes through the straw or not. Somehow, it seems like it could be an experiment there with thinking about the pipes potentially freezing and the fire hydrants freezing and the hoses down in Antarctica. Next question I have for you, Jeremy, is are there any special ceremonies that happen down in Antarctica, or are there any special traditions?
That's a really fun question. Yes, there are. There are actually a lot of different ceremonies and traditions. So the people have been going down to Antarctica for quite some time. As you guys know. But the traditions around a lot of the research bases go back to the 50s and 60s when originally the United States Navy set up these research bases, and then it eventually transitioned over to the National Science Foundation and the Antarctic Program that I was just talking about. But there are some really interesting ones that I was lucky enough to be a part of. The first one is the South Pole ceremony. So around or at New Year's Day, so on January 1st, every year, there's a ceremony to actually move the South Pole. And at the station, there is an actual pole, and I can show you a picture in just a minute of what that looks like. There's an actual pole that marks the geographic South Pole of the planet. But interestingly enough, the South Pole marker on the surface has to move about 10 meters or about 32 feet every year, because you have the giant Antarctic ice sheet that moves over the surface of the Earth about 10 meters a year. So every year, just to readjust where the South Pole is, we have this ceremony where everyone on the station lines up in a big semicircle, and they take the pole and they move it. Everyone gets to hold the pole and they move it from one place to another. So if you think about this as the Earth and this as the ice sheet, the Antarctic ice sheet over the South Pole, it's going to move about 10 meters a year. So if my thumb is the actual South Pole marker, at the beginning of the year, it's going to start here. At the end of the year, it's going to be here. So we have a ceremony that everyone gets to participate in, where we actually move the pole. So I'm going to share my screen again, and you can see a picture of what that looks like. let's see if I can get to it. Okay, so you see everyone lined up in a row and actually passing the pole. So that right there is the actual South Pole marker. And every year, that's the pole that moves. And you see everyone comes together. It's a really special time where everyone gets to participate in this pretty beautiful ceremony. And ultimately, it ends up just there. So it doesn't look like a whole lot. It's a flag, a pole, and a sign. But believe it or not, that is the actual geographic South Pole of the planet. So it's pretty neat that we all got to participate in that. And there are a few other pretty neat ceremonies as well. Some are more scientific driven, some are more community driven. So one of the really interesting things about being in Antarctica is that you're in a very small community of scientists and support staff, and you're very, very remote. So everyone comes together, and there's a sense of community there that's pretty extraordinary. So when it's a little bit warmer out, they actually hold a concert. So anyone who has got musical instrument skills comes together and plays in a concert called Ice Stock. So they build a stage and everyone has food and listens to music together. Another cool tradition is a 5K or 5 kilometer Thanksgiving Day run. So anyone who's at McMurdo Station on Thanksgiving can participate in a race from McMurdo Station, 5 kilometers, over to Scott Base, which is a New Zealand research base just down the coast. And there's a road that connects the two, and you can take part in a run that helps to have the US researchers and support staff and the New Zealand researchers and support staff come together for a pretty fun event.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. So Jeremy, I do have a few more questions for you, but I thought right now I might open it up to our students and see if any of them have questions for you as well. Sure. So I do see some hands going up. So students, we'll start with Mr. Lee's class and then go over to Mr. McLaughlin and then Miss Long. So that will be the order. So I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself, and then Mr. Lee's class, you guys are ready to go ahead for your first question for Jeremy. All right, go right ahead.
Were you ever scared of anything over there?
Was I ever scared of anything over there? There were definitely some hairy circumstances, but no, luckily nothing really bad happened while I was down there. And I think that was just because everyone really came together. And I think that happens often down there, to work as a team and make sure that everyone's being as safe as could be. It's a really remote place, like I was saying, and there's a lot of things that could be dangerous, but if everyone really works together and checks their equipment and does the right type of takes the right type of safety precautions, people have a pretty favorable outcome. So all of the science that was going on while I was down there turned out pretty well, and luckily no one was injured too badly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds like lots of teamwork goes into it. All right, Mr. McLaughlin, your class is ready. Go ahead.
What is one piece of technology, either on board ship or when crews are out on land, that is helpful in keeping folks safe from the elements?
Oh, great question. So there are lots of new technologies, I think, that are coming up every year that are really important and can help you or science teams to stay safe. So in the elements, I think the advanced clothing, so types of insulation and actual outerwear that you wear is really, really important. So think back to in the times of Shackleton, they didn't really have a whole lot of very warm clothing. They were wearing things that were pretty thin and would get worn with the elements, whereas now when you're down in Antarctica, you can wear really thick, warm clothing that doesn't lose its warmth when it gets wet or when you sweat. So that's one thing. Another thing that has come up in the last 10 years or so is advancements in satellite communication. So obviously you don't have telephone lines or cell phone reception like you would here in North America, but there are satellite communication devices now that are really small and very portable that you can take with you, whether you're on a ship, on a research base, or out really remote in the fields, where you can dial a phone number back in the US or back in Canada and talk to someone and ask questions or get help if you need to. That didn't really exist even 15, 20 years ago. So that's a pretty great piece of technology.
Great. All right, Miss Long's class, you all are next. Go ahead.
So have you actually ever had to evacuate the ship?
So it's a great question. So I was not on the ship like the other folks that you've talked to in the last few weeks. So I can't speak to that, but when I was at the research bases on the continent of Antarctica, I can say that luckily, no, we never had to evacuate. That's really the last option that anyone would want to take because it's so cold. To make sure that the inside areas of all of the stations are as safe and habitable as possible. So if something happened, everyone who was working outside could come inside and stay safe.
Excellent. So students, I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any more hands for some questions. All right, we're going to go to Miss Chapman's class first. We haven't heard from them yet. And then we'll circle back to Mr. Lee's and Mr. McLaughlin's. So, Miss Chapman's class, you can go ahead.
Oh, how do you fight fires without freezing in the hose?
That's a great question. So we had two different options when we needed to put out a fire. So water was one of them. And when you cycle water through a pump in a fire engine, it cycles really fast and comes out of a hose really fast. So effectively, you're spraying water before it could freeze. But we also had a lot of something called dry chem, which is a chemical that kind of looks like a powder. And instead of water, we had a whole bunch of that dry chem chemical in our fire trucks. So we had special tanks and special hoses that we could use to spray and put out a fire that wouldn't require water. Because you're right, one of the biggest problems and challenges that we have as firefighters in Antarctica is that water freezes very, very quickly. So for any type of really cold weather operation or anything down by the airfield, we would use or attempt to use this dry chem powder.
Wow, wonderful. Great question. All right, Mr. Lee's class, it is your turn again. So I'll unmute you. Go right ahead.
Hey, Brandon. So, okay, so are animals ever a threat to you or your community?
Oh, great question. So I'll answer that in two parts. So it's kind of different from one station to another. So the stations on the coast, that's going to be McMurdo Station and Palmer Station, see wildlife. But I would say they're definitely not a threat. In fact, they're kind of a treat for researchers and people who are on the research station to get to see. And there's a lot of really cool things that you can see. There are Waddell seals that we see quite a bit. There are skua birds, which are these giant gray birds that really like to try to eat food if you take food outside of a building. And then there are penguins as well. So there are big emperor penguins and smaller Adelie penguins. And when the ice breaks up and the water comes right up to the station in the warmer months of the summer, you could even potentially see orca whales surfacing, which is pretty neat. And then if you move inside the continent, into the interior where South Pole Station is, it's actually so cold and so remote that there is no natural wildlife there. Scientists have found evidence of microbes down in the ice, and even maybe a bird that's gotten lost from the coast, but there's actually no wildlife there whatsoever. But what my colleagues and I who were working down there together got to do, which is pretty neat, is actually interact with the wildlife. So most of the time, people who are down in Antarctica with the US Antarctic Program can't really interact with the wildlife. They can take photos, they can look at binoculars and see them from a distance, but everyone operates under something called the Antarctic Treaty, which is something that was signed back in 1961, and really kind of lays out the rules for all the different countries who have a presence in Antarctica, how they should work and behave in Antarctica. And one of those tenets that's listed in the treaty is to preserve wildlife. So what the United States says is anyone who's down there can't go and poke or hug or try to take home any type of wildlife that's down there. But the only exception to that is when something like a seal or a penguin comes onto the runway and there are planes landing. So like I said, that I spent a lot of time down at the runway working with the Air Force and all the different plane companies that were landing there. So if we saw a seal or a penguin that came out onto the runway and there was a plane landing soon, obviously we wouldn't want those wildlife to get hurt by the plane landing, and we wouldn't want that to injure any of the people on the plane. So we'd have to go out onto the runway and try to shoo off the seal or shoo off the penguin. And believe it or not, the best way to do that with penguins, at least, is you come and you waddle just like a penguin and you come up behind them, and they don't like that very much, so they'll scurry away. And actually, it's a great question. I'm going to share my screen one more time and show you some pretty cool pictures of penguins from down there. So here is what those penguins look like. So these are emperor penguins. And I was lucky enough to see this group. They don't really like to interact with people too much. They are pretty solitary, but they're beautiful to look at, especially in the wild. And it's cool. They can come right up to you. You can see their footprints, and then what a footprint looks like next to a human footprint. All right, that was a great question.
Wonderful. All right, so next we have Mr. McLaughlin's class, who has another question for us. So go right ahead.
So my question was, do you guys ever, oh yes, how long was the plane ride to Antarctica? Like, did you have to take a plane to get to like the place you like met up people, or how would that work?
Yeah, the whole trip was very, very long. So anyone who's coming from the United States would take a plane from wherever they were to Christchurch, New Zealand. And that's where the US Antarctic Program is headquartered, down there. So we'd go to New Zealand, we'd get all of our gear together, and then we'd get on one of those big Air Force transport planes that I showed you earlier on. We'd get inside with all of the cargo and the boxes, and it would be about a 5-hour flight down to McMurdo Station. And everyone who goes to either McMurdo Station or South Pole stops first at McMurdo Station. But one of the problems is that you can't predict the weather. So the weather has to be really good for planes to land down on the continent. So a lot of times what will happen is a plane will go halfway there or even 3/4 of the way there. And if the weather turns bad, the plane's going to have to turn around. So a 5-hour trip could turn into a 10-hour round trip where you just wind up exactly where you started. I was lucky enough where I got down on my first try, but the plane right after me took, I think, 3 or 4 attempts over 3 or 4 days to get down there. So took quite a while. But from McMurdo Station to South Pole, you get on one of those smaller planes with skis, and that's about another 4 or 5 hours to get to South Pole Station.
Antarctica is definitely large. All right, Miss Long, it looks like your class has a question. And then is there if anyone else has a question after Miss Long's class? It looks like Mr. Lee's class has another question. So we'll head to you after Miss Long's class. All right, Miss Long's class, go ahead.
How did you get all the safety gear and like the trucks there?
That's a great question. So a lot of the gear it stays down there. We don't take it back every year. But when we need to ship something really big, like a fire truck, it goes on either one of the big airplanes, but more often than not, a really big cargo ship comes in just once a year, and it brings things like necessary supplies, science equipment, food, maybe construction equipment, but it'll also bring things like new fire trucks or some of the bigger equipment that we have. And what our fire trucks are really, really big. Some of them look similar to what you might see here in North America, but others look really different. And it's a great question because I happen to have a picture of what they look like to illustrate the point a little bit. So let me find those pictures. Here we go. So this looks kind of similar to something that you might see here. This is a big tanker truck. So over the 2 wheels in the back is where all the water is, but this is a really long truck. This is another fire truck that's similar to what you'd see here in the US, but after this, that's where it stops. So this is one of those fire trucks that has the dry chemical in it. And you see that we've replaced wheels with these tank treads. And what this allows us to do is go out on the ice and snow, whereas if we had wheels, we might get stuck. These really thick treads would allow us to go almost anywhere we needed to go. And it gets even weirder from there. So this is also a fire truck. It doesn't look like one. I think it looks more like a tank, but that entire back half has a bunch of different tanks in it, all with that dry chemical. And this would stay down at the airfield. And this is how we would potentially fight any fires that were down at the airfield or any plane fires or anything like that. You can see it going along the ice there. At the South Pole, it gets even weirder. So this is what a South Pole fire truck looks like. There's a crane that's helping to put on the tanks, but this big yellow truck up front that we actually call the Elephant Man because it looks a little bit like an elephant, is where the people sit, the driver sit, and all the firefighters sit, and it pulls this giant sled in the back here, and that giant sled is where we keep all of the dry chemical that we would use to put out a fire. So these are really big pieces of equipment that if we needed to get them off or on the continent, would definitely come by that ship.
Wow, I don't think I've ever seen fire trucks that look quite like that. That was very, very cool to see. Mr. Lee's class, it looks like you guys are ready for your next question. So we'll unmute you and go right ahead.
Okay, where do you get your energy from? And if you have generators, where does the generators get energy from?
So they come from a couple different sources. So in the last few years, I know that they have really been investing in renewable energy. So at McMurdo Station, there's a really big wind turbine that helps to power the station. There's also regular generators and a regular electric plant because there's so much energy is required to run the station and all of the research projects. So there is regular electricity that you get here in the US. So we basically take a regular electric power plant, make it a lot smaller, make it a lot more efficient, and that's what is powering the station at McMurdo, and then partially what's powering the South Pole and Palmer as well. But I know that the Antarctic program and the National Science Foundation especially is really interested in making more power through renewable energy, solar, wind. So they're working on upgrading all of the stations over the next few years to make them really sustainable.
Wonderful. That was a great question as well. So next, it looks like, did I see a hand over at Miss Chapman's class? I think so. So we'll go to Miss Chapman's class, and then Mr. McLaughlin's class has another question. And then we can go back to Miss Long. So Miss Chapman's class, you are ready to go.
Okay, so do you have to stick to a diet, or do you have free range of what you can eat?
A little bit of both. So there aren't any stores or restaurants, unfortunately, in Antarctica, and we really only get to eat what's down there. So at each station, there is a cafeteria similar to what you'd see at your school. But luckily, the chefs down there are really, really good. So they'll come up with a whole bunch of different options for every meal. So you could have cereal for breakfast, you could have eggs for breakfast. And eggs is an interesting one because they coat them in this special preserve that lets them stay a lot longer because obviously we don't have chickens hatching fresh eggs all the time down there. So having fresh food is definitely a challenge. But we'll have different types of meats, vegetables sometimes, depending on when we can get them down there. But among the options that the cafeteria and the chefs provide for us, we can choose anything. One of the challenges for people who spend the winter in Antarctica is getting enough vitamin D. So they try to have as many vitamin D rich foods as possible, but nothing too special.
Great, and we heard a little bit about that from Holly also, about how they have enough vegetables for a while and then they might have to get a resupply of them or eat canned vegetables from then on out. All right, Mr. McLaughlin's class, you are all set.
How often do flights come in, and when during the year do they come in, and what determines that?
So can you say that one more time?
When during the year do flights come in, and what determines the season that they come in?
Yeah, so the flights come in most of the time all throughout the summer and warmer months. When flights really don't come in and out is during the winter. And remember, the seasons are flipped from the northern hemisphere where we are to the southern hemisphere. When it's winter there, it's dark 24 hours a day. The sun never rises above the horizon, and it's very, very cold. So it's extra dangerous for flights to come in and out. So the continent really shuts down. When the sun does start to rise above the horizon at the end of winter into summer is when the first few flights will come in, and they'll bring some critical staff. They'll bring some fresh food and some supplies. And then flights are pretty continuous depending on the weather throughout the entire summer season. And that's also the peak science season. So most of the scientists and researchers who come in and out of Antarctica will come during the summer science season. And that's when the bulk of the flights are. But I do know that in the last few years, they have been working with a few private companies and the Air Force to test flights coming in during the winter just in case of an emergency. So that'll be interesting to see how that turns out soon.
Excellent. So we are going to head to Ms. Long's class for their question, and then it looks like we'll go after that to Mr. Lee, and then Ms. Chapman and Mr. McLaughlin. If you guys have one more question, we probably have time for one question from each of us. So Ms. Long's class, go right ahead.
Where do you keep the fire trucks, and why do you need so many?
So we keep the fire trucks in a couple of different places. They stay outside most of the time just because we have quite a few and we don't have enough space inside to keep them. At that big base that I was talking about, McMurdo Station, there's actually a firehouse with a garage, so we can keep the two main fire trucks that we use there inside and keep them warm. But our spare fire trucks and the fire trucks that look like tanks that I was showing you that stay by the airfield, those stay outside actually. There's not water in them, so they can stay outside and they won't freeze. But that's just because down there, there aren't enough buildings in Antarctica to house all the different types of equipment that we need to cover. So one of the responsibilities every day is if there are snow drifts, or any type of snow buildup in the morning, we've got to go outside and clean off the trucks and make sure that they're ready to go. And we have so many because we actually cover a really wide area. So we have the research station itself, and then we have the airfield, which is a whole different area nearby. And then we have an entirely different station down at South Pole, which is a couple 100 miles away. So we need all these different pieces of equipment to help respond to different types of emergencies and cover a pretty big area with not that many people.
Great and wonderful question. So Mr. Lee's class, you all are next. We'll unmute you. All right, and go ahead.
So, how long did you stay in Antarctica? Also, where are you now?
All right, so I was in Antarctica for about 6.5 months or so. And right now I'm in someplace that's slightly warmer. I am in Portland, Maine, in the US. So a little bit warmer, although not always. I think last week during that polar vortex, it was colder here than it was in Antarctica. So I felt right at home.
Great, and we have next Miss Chapman's class. All right, go ahead.
All right, how do you guys store your garbage and waste without affecting the environment?
Yeah, it's a big focus of the station for sure. In fact, there's a whole waste management department, and there's even a hazardous waste department at the different research stations just to take care of the trash, because everyone on station is so concerned with not polluting the environment and keeping it as pristine as possible. So there are really big bins kind of all over the station that are marked with really specific things that you can put in them. So if you think about your home or your classroom, you've got your garbage and your recycling. If you make that, times that by about 4 or 5, that's the number of different bins that we've got to sort through all of our trash and recyclables and hazardous waste that we may have. And then those are capped and bagged so they don't leak at all. And then when that giant ship comes in that I was talking about before, once they offload everything that the station needs, we'll put onto it a lot of our trash, and they'll bring the trash and the waste back to the US and process it, where it's a lot easier to do in the US than it is in Antarctica.
Excellent. And we also had, for those of you who remember back to our life on the vessel, we had a similar question there for the crew on the vessel, and they had a very similar answer. So it's definitely something that people who are working in Antarctica are very aware of, is the waste. So Mr. McLaughlin's class, you have one final question, and then Lucy, if you have a question, or Miss Patterson's class, if you guys want to type into the chat so we can see your question, or you're welcome to show us your video so you can ask one final question as well. Until then, Mr. McLaughlin's class, go ahead.
So our class is studying like technology and exploration. What do you think the most like important piece of technology in Antarctica is?
Oh, that's a really big question. I think that would depend on a lot of the different science projects that are going on down there, and really every year it's different. So one of the really neat things that's being done right now is NASA is down there and has been for a number of years looking at Antarctica as an analogy to life on Mars. So how astronauts can survive in a really harsh environment like Mars. They'll bring astronauts down and figure out what technology, what types of procedures, what can they do to practice and prepare for a really long trip to a place like Mars. So I think a lot of the technology coming out of there is super interesting. And they're also testing a lot of, like I was saying, renewable energy that could be operated in harsh environments and austere environments. So I think a lot of that type of technology will really benefit a lot more than just Antarctica. A great question.
Excellent. And we have a question from Lucy from the chat, which is, what was the lowest temperature that you experienced while you were there?
So I have a picture of it, not with me, but I think we bottomed out at -104 with the wind chill. So that may have been negative 60 or -70 with a really strong wind, but really, really cold. It's one of those days where you didn't want to go outside at all. In fact, they don't want you to go outside. It's they have big signs everywhere when the weather is really, really bad, and they tell you to stay inside, which is good for the people who are in charge of safety.
Absolutely. So Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. I have one final question for you that is, it's a two-part question. Do you want to go back to Antarctica? And if you had any advice for students who are hoping to get to Antarctica someday, what advice would you give to students?
Do I want to go back to Antarctica? Absolutely. In fact, I talk about it all the time. I'm still very close with a lot of the people I worked with in Antarctica, and we always talk about it. It's one of those places that you go and it never really leaves you, so I would love to get back some point soon. The advice that I'd give to anyone who wants to go is be curious, do research. I thought that only scientists with very specific degrees could go down there, and they do. But there's a lot of other options and a lot of other possibilities. So if you're a really curious person who doesn't happen to be a scientist or studying some type of technical skill, maybe you're in liberal arts or business, there's lots of different ways and lots of different value that you can bring to different projects that are going on in Antarctica. So be curious, do research, reach out to people. Everyone that I've ever met who's been down there always wants to talk about it and would love to talk about it with students too. So reach out to me, reach out to anyone you can find, you can talk to, and we'd love to talk more about it.
Amazing. That is such great advice. And students, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And Jeremy, I want to thank you very much for joining us today and sharing with us your experiences down in Antarctica. I'm going to let the students say a goodbye and a thank you to you. So I will go ahead and start unmuting our students. And students, also, if you have any further questions, please send them along and we can get them to Jeremy as well. So here we go for our unmuting. All right. Thank you so much again, Jeremy. And for students and teachers, we have tomorrow, we have a live video conference with Holly and 2 mystery guests. And that is at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So you can ask your teachers to go ahead and register for that video conference as well. So thank you so much again, Jeremy, and thank you to all of our teachers and classes who joined us today.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Absolutely. See you later.